Shalom, all praise to Yahweh Shemel Shah, double honor to the Apostle GMS. My name is Amna Allah, coming at you with part 2 of this video that I did the other day, or maybe not the other day, 2 days ago, I believe it was. No, it was the other day, and going into the United Nations Convention on the prevention and punishment of the crime of genocide, and one of the definitions that it gave of genocide was seeking to basically destroy a group of people in whole or in part, mentally or physically. And I gave it an example mentally by going into how schizophrenia became a disease associated with Jake. As a matter of fact, I started off with this scripture, and I might as well start it off with this scripture again to refresh your memory. Now, when I did that show originally wasn't gonna be, because I did a show on this originally like a year ago, maybe a year or two ago, when I found out about the Genocide Convention of 1948, I believe it was, and that was on cancer. On cancer, how cancer is manipulated to exterminate Jake, you know. And as I was doing the other lesson the other day, I said, you know what? Oh snap! I remember I went into the Genocide Convention like a year or two ago. So why not make this a part 2 to that? And so during that show, towards the end of that show, it came into my mind to do that, you know. So this is Deuteronomy chapter 28, verse 28. The Lord shall smite thee with madness and blindness and astonishment of heart. So the Lord said he's going to smite Israel with madness, blindness, and astonishment of heart. Okay? That's talking about different types of mental disorders that he was going to smite the children of Israel with. Okay? And going back here to the Genocide Convention, this is Wikipedia, the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. When you jump down to the definitions of genocide, it says Article 2 of the Convention defines genocide as any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such, killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group. And that's what we're going into. Okay? Causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group. And in this particular aspect, we're talking about mental harm. Okay? So let's continue into this lesson. This is another article, How Schizophrenia Became a Black Disease. How Schizophrenia Became a Black Disease, an interview with Jonathan Metzl. I believe I went into this before, but this is the same article I went to last time. Okay, let me just scroll down a little bit. Okay, this is a similar article, but it's like a little more in depth, you could say. This is not the same exact article I went to last time. Alright, so let me read. It says, in the late 1960s, schizophrenia's profile as a disease changed dramatically. Iona State Hospital, I'm not going to read this up here. In fact, I might as well read it. First, some preliminaries about your fascinating book, The Protest Psychosis, How Schizophrenia Became a Black Disease, Beacon 2010. How did you come to unearth such a trove of important documents at Iona State Hospital in northeastern Michigan? Iona State Hospital for the Criminally Insane was, for much of the 20th century, one of the nation's more notorious mental asylums, occupying an incredible 529 acres, and its annual census hovered above 2,000 patients. But like many American asylums, Iona suffered a rapid fall from grace in the late 1960s and early 70s during the so-called era of deinstitutionalization. By 1974, the census was a paltry 300, and in 1975, the facility closed, then quickly reopened as a prison. That rapid transformation fascinated me. What had happened to the patients? What had changed? Why did the hospital become a prison? I spent a long time searching for the records and ultimately discovered that much of the hospital's institutional memory, nearly a century of patient charts, reports, photographs, ledgers, and other artifacts, have been placed randomly in storage in the State Archive of Michigan in Lansing. I spent another year gaining clearance from various review boards, since of course the archive contains highly personal and confidential information. Then spent the next 4 years reviewing the charts over 800 patients. What I found troubled me greatly. As I write in the book, The charts documented in minute detail the tragedy of what it meant to be warehoused in a state asylum at mid-century, and in particular in an asylum where short court sentences devolved into lifelong incarceration. A number of charts contain yearly notes from patients to their doctors saying such sentiments as, "Doc, I really think I'm cured," or "Dear doctor, I believe I'm ready to go home," or "You have no right to keep me here." These letters stack 30s deep in some charts, signifying years of pleading and longing and anger, together with 30 years of responses from clinicians urging, "You are almost there," or "Perhaps next year." Invariably, the last note in each stack was a death certificate from the Ionia coroner. So never let these people out of this hospital. When did you first suspect the diagnostic patterns with schizophrenia had become heavily racialized? I found dramatic racial and gender shifts in persons diagnosed with schizophrenia at Ionia during the 1960s. So much so that schizophrenia's racial and gender transformation became the central narrative of my book. This shift became apparent very early in my research. Before the 60s, Ionia doctors viewed schizophrenia as an illness that afflicted non-violent, white, petty criminals. So schizophrenia before the 1960s, remember last show I went to the DSM, it was called the Diagnostic Statistical Manual for Mental Illnesses, DSM. The DSM-1 came out in 52, the DSM-2 came out in 1968. So before the 1960s, which was when only the DSM-1 was out, doctors viewed schizophrenia as an illness that afflicted non-violent white petty criminals, including the hospital's considerable population of women from rural Michigan. Charge emphasized the negative impact of schizophrenogenic styles on these women's abilities to perform their duties as mothers and wives. To say the least, these patients were not seen as threatening. "This patient wasn't able to take care of her family as she should," read one chart. Another, "This patient is not well adjusted and can't do her housework." And another, "She got confused and talked too loudly and embarrassed her husband." By the mid to late 1960s, however, schizophrenia was diagnosed as disproportionately applied to the hospital's growing population of African American men from urban Detroit. Perhaps the most shocking evidence I uncovered was that hospital charts diagnosed these men in part because of their symptoms, but also because of their connection to the civil rights movement. So these men were diagnosed because of their so-called diagnosed because of their symptoms in part, but also because of their connection to the civil rights movement. Many of the men were sent to Ionia after convictions for crimes that ranged from armed robbery to participation in civil rights protests to property destruction during periods of civil arrest, such as the Detroit riots in 1968. Remember the last show I went to the Long Hot Summer? The Long Hot Summer was 1967, where there was 159 riots across the country. Okay? Charts stress how hallucinations and delusions rendered these men as threats, not only to other patients, but also to clinicians, ward attendants, and to society itself. You see comments like "paranoid against his doctors and the police," or "will be a danger to society were he not in the institution." So we're seeing them racializing the disease known as schizophrenia. Get this other scripture where it says let's see. There you go. Deuteronomy 28:61. It says also every sickness. Also 60. Deuteronomy 28:60. Moreover, he will bring upon thee all the diseases of Egypt, which thou wast afraid of, and they shall cleave unto thee. Verse 61. Also every sickness and every plague, which is not written in the book of this law, then will the Lord bring upon thee until thou be destroyed. Schizophrenia is not written in the Bible, but the Most High is going to bring that upon Israel. Okay? And we're reading about it now. Did the second edition of the DSM released in 1968 have a significant influence on that shift in emphasis? These are questions that he's being asked. Okay? It says one of the key pieces of evidence I used to help explain the shift seen in Ionia is through an extensive analysis of the changing language associated with the official psychiatric definition of schizophrenia. Before the 60s, psychiatry often posited that schizophrenia was a psychological reaction to a splitting of the basic function of personality. Official descriptors emphasize the generally calm nature of such persons. So before it was described as being having a split personality, and it was emphasized the general calm nature of such persons. Now this doesn't mean that mental illnesses never existed in the world, which that's just demons that's on you. But we see Esau is changing the definition and the symptoms and and the diagnosis of these different diseases. It says official descriptions emphasize the general calm nature of such persons, calm nature of people who were said to have schizophrenia prior to the 1960s, in ways that encourage association with middle-class housewives. But the frame changed in the 1960s. In 1968, in the midst of a political climate marked by profound protests and social unrest, psychiatry published the second edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. This is right after that long hot summer, right? That text recast the paranoid subtype of schizophrenia as a disorder of masculinized belligerence. So now they recasted it as masculinized belligerence or masculinized aggression or hostility. The patient's attitude is frequently hostile and aggressive. DSM-2 claimed, and his behavior tends to be consistent with his delusions. I have a lot of data in my book that shows how this language, particularly terms such as hostility and aggression, was used to justify schizophrenia diagnosis in black men at Ionia in the 1960s and 1970s, because they claimed the paranoid subtype of schizophrenia was recasted as masculinized belligerence, masculinized hostility, or masculinized aggression. Why? Because this is the period of when protests is happening all across the country. Riots are happening all across the country. So if you can have these men or these masculine individuals who are showing aggression or hostility or belligerence towards society by rioting, if you could take the paranoid subtype of schizophrenia and you change the diagnosis to someone of masculinized belligerence, then now the men that are showing the masculinized belligerence, or the ones that are rioting, when you lock them up or when you put them in the hospital, you can diagnose them as being schizophrenic, and you can start injecting them with different drugs. Because after all, schizophrenia was recasted as masculine belligerence. And who was showing masculine belligerence at that time? In their eyes, the so-called black man who was rioting against the society. He was showing that belligerence or that aggression or that violence or the hostility towards society, even though the white man was the one that was gunning us down. So if anybody should be diagnosed, it should be them. How would you explain that shift, and would you view American psychiatry in those years as exhibiting either manifest or unconscious racism? Was it just coincidence that the DSM-2 language enabled the diagnosis of schizophrenia among increasing numbers of African Americans? That's a very important question. I argue exclusively in my book that the purpose of my analysis is not to lay blame for individual racism, because I feel that such blame games oversimplify what was going on. Many of the doctors at Ionia generally wanted to help their patients. Yeah, right. They probably wanted to help them Edomites, but not Israel, not Jake. I also talked to psychiatrists who worked on the DSM-2 who told me that they were trying to do the best they could to produce scientific, objective diagnostic criteria. All right. Go back. Psalms 10:1. Why standest thou far off, O Lord? Why hidest thou thyself in times of trouble? And we asked the Lord, why does he hide himself in times of trouble? That was a time of trouble back then, but the Most High didn't make his move yet, because it wasn't time to make his move. Verse 2, the wicked in his pride doeth persecute the poor. Let them be taken in the devices that they have imagined. So Esau in his pride persecuted the poor, and we're giving you examples like persecuted the poor by diagnosing Jake Israelites with his mental illness. Okay? Let them be taken in the devices they have imagined. So, but Esau's going to be taken in the devices that he's imagined. Because now you got even got Edomites, some Edomite men out there that got that's diagnosed with schizophrenia too. But it's not as much as Israel. For the wicked boasteth of his heart's desire, and blesseth the covetous whom the Lord abhorreth. Okay? The wicked, through the pride of his countenance, will not seek after the Most High. The Most High is not in all his thoughts. The Most High is not in the thoughts of these Edomites, man. And the wicked is talking about Esau, you so-called white people. Verse 5, his ways are always grievous. Thy judgments are far above out of his sight. As for all his enemies, he puffeth at them. and his ways are always grievous, and we're reading about his grievous ways right now. Diagnosing Jake with mental disorders, thy judgments are far above out of his sight. As for all his enemies, he puffeth at them. He's showing pride towards his enemies, man. He looks at the enemies as being beneath him. Esau feels that no one is his equal, not even the Heavenly Father. He has said in his heart, I should not be removed, I should not be moved, for I should never be in adversity. But boy, you're gonna be in adversity real soon, devil. Keep reading. At the same time, my evidence shows how even the most scientific diagnostic criteria can reflect the social environment in which they are produced. A process of discuss. A process I discuss through the language of structural and institutional violence. So it shows you even the most scientific diagnostic criteria can reflect the social environments in which they are produced. So if you have a certain social environment or social climate that's occurring in America, scientific diagnostic criteria can reflect that. So if you live in a society where there are a lot of riots, for example, then it only makes sense that scientific diagnostic criteria will be somewhat of a reflection of what's occurring in society. So if you have a lot of riots going on in society, then it only makes sense that science will begin to view certain mental disorders as being a reflection of that violence. Oh, they're showing belligerence. Oh, they're showing hostility. They're burning things. They're destroying things. They're mentally unstable. They have this disease, schizophrenia. You see how that works? This was certainly the case for the DSM-2. As I showed, the manual's emphasis, that's why I came out in 68, during the time period of long hot summer. As I showed, the manual's emphasis on hostility and aggression reflected a much wider set of national conversations and anxieties about civil rights. The shifting frame surrounding schizophrenia had dire consequences for African American men held at the Ionia State Hospital during the Civil Rights era. More badly, my evidence also shows that growing numbers of research articles in professional journals use this language to cast schizophrenia as a disorder of racialized aggression. See that? The shifting frame surrounding schizophrenia had dire consequences for African American men held at Ionia State Hospital during the Civil Rights era. So the shifting frame that surrounded schizophrenia had bad consequences for the so-called black man, the tribe of Judah, okay, during the Civil Rights era, because that's when they was rioting, okay? And there was a growing number of research articles and journals that cast schizophrenia as a disorder of racialized aggression. And in the worst cases, psychiatric authors conflated the schizophrenic symptoms of African American patients with the perceived schizophrenia of civil rights protests. See that? Particularly those organized by Black Power, the Black Panthers, the Nation of Islam, or other activist groups. Ultimately, new psychiatric definitions of schizophrenic illness in the 60s impacted persons of many different racial and ethnic black backgrounds. Some patients became schizophrenic because of the changes in diagnostic criteria rather than in their clinical symptoms. In other words, some people became schizophrenic because the diagnostic criteria labeled schizophrenia as masculinized belligerence or masculinized hostility or violence or aggression. That's what schizophrenia became labeled as, masculinized aggression. Right? So some people became schizophrenic overnight. Because one day schizophrenia was listed as something associated with non-violent petty white criminals. Those of a calm nature. But then overnight it becomes associated with masculinized aggression. So now other people that was in Ionia State Hospital that didn't have signs of schizophrenia one day, the next day they did. Why? Because the diagnostic criteria called for schizophrenia to be viewed as masculinized aggression. So if someone was aggressive one day during the time of schizophrenia wasn't listed as having symptoms of aggression, then that person wasn't schizophrenic. But if the next day they all of a sudden became schizophrenia was associated with violence, then that person who wasn't schizophrenic the day before all of a sudden became schizophrenic the next day. It wasn't because of the clinical symptoms, it was because of the criteria of the diagnosis. That's how these devils operate. There's more I can read here, but I want to go to this. I want to go read a little more here. Verse 7. His mouth is full of cursing and deceit and fraud. Under his tongue is mischief and vanity. Right. His mouth is full of cursing and deceit and fraud. He curses the Most High, blasphemes the Most High, and is full of deceit and fraud. Look at that word fraud. injury, oppression, oppressor. So his mouth is full of deceit and oppression. And we're reading about that now. Okay? We've got another article. How big is this? The article is kind of big. Okay, this one isn't that bad. I'm going to read this one. It's time to tackle mental health inequality among black people. Edward Davey. Lambeth will lead the way in the treatment of mental health in black communities. Okay, it says, with African and Caribbean people far more likely to be diagnosed with a serious mental illness, it is filmed that World Mental Health Day falls in Black History Month this year. Black men in Britain are 17 times more likely than white counterparts to be diagnosed with a psychotic illness. 17 times more, man. 17 times more. That means if it's 10 white men, it's 170 black men. If it's 1,000 white men, then it's 17,000 black men. If it's 10,000 white men, then it's 170,000 black men. If it's 1 million white men, then it's 17 million black men. That's genocide right there. Any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such, and you go right to B, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group. That's genocide right there, man. Can't nobody tell me different. In Lambeth, and this is in the UK, this is in the United Kingdom. So this goes all the way to Europe. Not only Europe, but in the United States, to be right earlier. It was Michigan, right? In Lambeth, that's where Union State Hospital is, in Lansing, Michigan. In Lambeth, with the country's biggest black population, we at Lambeth Council launched a new report aimed at tackling this kind of inequality. We hope to end a situation which means that while 26% of Lambeth's population is black, nearly 70% of the borough's residents in secure psychiatric settings are of African or Caribbean heritage. That's Israelites right there, man. Even though they make up 26% of the population. And Lambeth has the country's biggest black population, but black people make up 26% of the population, but 70% of that borough's residents in secure psychiatric settings are of African or Caribbean heritage, which they're Israelites. We also never want to see a repeat of circumstances that led to the death in 2008 of black musician Sean Rigg, who died in police custody after being restrained by officers during a schizophrenic episode. The coroner's report highlighting serious failings by the local NHS and police led to the establishment of the Lambeth Black Health and Wellbeing Commission that launched its final report on October 10th, or 10th of October. Our aim in establishing some more stuff I could read here, but that was the main point that I wanted to get. Okay. Thing acting stupid. Alright, I close it. Okay. What else you got here? Psalm 10:7. His mouth is full of cursing and deceit and fraud. Under his tongue is mischief and vanity. He sitteth in the lurking places of the villages, like he did in Lambeth. He in the lurking places of the villages, man, looking for someone to devour. In the secret places do he murder the innocent. The innocent is talking about Israel. Just as we read up here, the poor was talking about Israel. The wicked in his pride do persecute the poor. The wicked is Esau, the poor is Israel. Because we're the ones that's destitute. He sitteth in the lurking places of the villages. In the secret places doeth he murder the innocent. His eyes are privately set against the poor. Esau's eyes are privately or directly set against the poor. He lieth in wait secretly as a lion in his den. He lieth in wait to catch the poor. He doeth catch the poor when he draweth him into his net, into his trap. So he lies secretly as a lion that's in his den, and he lies in wait to catch the poor, meaning he's on the prowl. He has his eyes set on you, like how a lion about to strike. A lion has a focused stare on his prey, and then he pounces upon him. Well, guess what? Esau is just like that. He lies in wait to catch the poor. When he drove him to his net, a net is what attract. Okay? I'll read a little bit here too, and I'm gonna close. Being black, this is from The Guardian. I forgot to mention the last website. You could just type in the title of the website, the title of the article, and you can find it. Being black in Britain is bad for your mental health. There is an epidemic of psychotic illness in those of African and Caribbean origin. So why are we doing nothing to stop it? Because Esau wants Israelites destroyed. This is Kwame McKenzie, this is 2007. I have had problems being a psychiatrist since the first day I worked in the Moseley Hospital. The Moseley is in South London, and every day I saw more and more young people of African and Caribbean origin developing serious mental illnesses. As a young black man, I identified with them, found it disturbing and vowed to do something about it. So I started research in the area. Unfortunately, that made things worse rather than better, partly because the statistics are so chilling and partly because of the response to them. Over the last 30 years, there have been 20 studies showing that people of Caribbean and African origin have an increased risk of being treated for serious mental illnesses such as schizophrenia and mania. The increased rate is of epidemic proportions, between 5 and 12 times greater than for white people. See that? Now this one in this particular place is 5 to 12 times greater than white people, and if anything, it is getting worse. Matter of fact, that last article could have been more recent. So it could have been 5 to 12 in 2007, but the last article could have been closer to this present day. So it could have increased to 17 times to this very day. On March 31st each year, a one-day census is carried out for all Britain's psychiatric inpatients, and the results of last year's census have been published. Of the 32,000 people in hospital, those who define themselves as Black, Caribbean, and Black African were overrepresented by 3 or 4-fold. But one other group stood out. Those who define themselves as Black other. The vast majority of this group are young British-born Black people, and they were 18 times more likely to be in hospital than the British average. See, 18 times more likely to be in a hospital than the British average. It is always prudent to treat statistics with caution. Hospital admission. Hospital admission reflects not only the amount of illness in the community, but also the ability of the community to cope with that illness. For instance, in highly supportive, tight-knit communities, more people are treated at home, but it is hard to believe that this increased rate is not at least in part due to a true increase in the amount of illness. This is backed up by years of research and recent international review. Okay. Jump down. But the risk, I'll jump down from that sentence. But the risk is double in Black migrants to white countries. In fact, read a little more. It says, this is backed up by years of research and a recent international review, which concluded that migrants are more likely to develop mental illness. But the risk is double in Black migrants to white countries. See that? It's even double when Black migrants go to white countries because they want to get rid of them. And the risk is decreased again in their children. See that? It seems that it is not about migration alone or being Black. It is about being Black in a white country. So they're trying to get rid of Israel, man. The rate of serious mental illness in the Caribbean and in Africa is not high, but the rate of mental illness in Britons of Caribbean and African origin is. You can recover from a psychotic illness, but many people have long-term problems. The cost to the individual with a psychotic illness, to their family and careers, and wider society is immense. Most sufferers are unemployed and on benefit. There is an increased rate of suicide, life expectancy is lower, and the children are more likely to develop mental illness and be taken into care. In one study, 50% of careers were clinically depressed. This undermines their ability to support others. Okay, I could read a little bit more here. Let me see how much time I got here. I'll read a little bit more. Okay, psychotic illness start young and psychotic illnesses start young and persist, taking the cost of benefits and loss of tax revenue into account. Mental illness is the single most expensive part of the health budget. Those of African and Caribbean origin are already disproportionately living in poverty and struggling to offer a social system that supports and develops the young. How does a community stop itself from disintegrating under such a burden? Okay, let me jump down. We have an excellent plan for improving mental health services for Black and minority ethnic groups. But we need to go further. If we knew that one group in society were 10 times more likely to develop lung cancer, we would focus on them. That's a fact. That because that's justice right there. Perhaps with a targeted anti-smoking strategy, we would not just make lung cancer treatment services more equitable. Okay. Um. Though we will not be able to prevent all psychosis, we should be able to prevent some of it. We know that psychotic illnesses are associated with poverty, poor education, racism, living in the city, poor obstetric care, head injuries, or brain infection when you are young, child trauma, family breaking up, and cannabis use. We know that targeting child and adolescents is important. Prevention of mental illness in black communities is the sort of complex problem that should attract a high-level government inquiry that leads to action. I'm used to hearing politicians say that doing nothing is not an option. This is an area where the phrase has real meaning. The high rates of mental illness in people of Caribbean and African origin are not going to go away. If anything, their legacy will blight a generation and the impact will be felt by us all. Mental health services have been accused of institutional racism over their treatment of black patients. The government has asserted that this is not a useful term, but the lack of a coherent prevention strategy is an institutional problem that needs institutions, not individuals, to act. That's right. You know. So with that, I'm gonna close. Or if you ever learn something, all praise to Yahweh Bashim Al Shah, Bashim Rakak Wadash, and I'm gonna close. I'm gonna say Shalom.